Well, kia ora and welcome everybody. You're at the World Internet Project launch for 2021. Thank you very much for coming and joining us today. I'd like to open our session today with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe Māori ora. Welcome. I would also like to introduce myself and today as well. No ingarangi aku tipuna, he tangata tiriti o, e tipu aki o te kawatiri, i te rohe o Ngāti Apa ki te rā tō. Engare, e nainei e noho ana ki te Tamaki Makaurau, i te rohe o Kawarau Maki. Ko Andrew Cushion o, ko o te kaiarahi whakapā o Ipurangi Aotearoa. Or I'm Andrew Cushion, and I'm the Engagement Director here at Internet NZ. And it's my pleasure to be your hosts today as we talk about the World Internet Project launch. Joining me are the two speakers from the New Zealand Work Research Institute, which is the home of the World Internet Project here in New Zealand and based at AUT, Dr. Gail Patel and Alexander Turku, who is the lead researcher for this particular World Internet Project work. We're here today to talk about, in particular, the impact that lockdown has had on internet use, amongst a great deal of other insights that the World Internet Project provides. We know that there's been an impact on lockdown. For those of you that are in Auckland, like me, you're probably still locked down at home right now. And this entire event is coming to you absent of physical connection via the magic of the internet, like so much of our lives has been lately. And at least certainly here in New Zealand and many parts of the world, given where people are joining us from, we've watched exactly how the internet has become ever more valuable in keeping connectivity, our lives, our social connections, our economies, our working lives, all aspects going, while we've been dealing with the challenges of COVID-19. For those, of course, that are able to access the internet too. The World Internet Project has over time provided a great deal of data about the nature of digital divides and how that can hamper as well the use of the internet in these times where it is never more important. This, I think, demonstrates the value of the World Internet Project. And to really underscore the value that I and we see here, the World Internet Project provides us with comparative international data. Indeed, it is the World Internet Project hosted from around the world and providing comparative data that allows us to see not only what the stories are about how New Zealand is using the internet, but compare that with other places and jurisdictions around the world too. It's comprehensive in terms of the work that it does with sampling and surveying to get high quality data, and it's analysed by these fine people at the Work Research Institute at AUT to be able to provide really powerful insights. And those powerful insights and that background is why we here at Internet NZ are so proud to be associated with this. We have been for some time. In fact, I think we're coming up to, well, soon enough, we'll be at nearly a decade of working together in terms of this World Internet Project. We know that this data is useful, both in terms of its absolute nature of telling us what and how New Zealanders are using this technology, but also from that comparative basis too. We know about the applications of this data in terms of informing policy making, decision making, and any number of other different ways that we can gain insight and then use this data in order to make decisions. And so look, it's certainly my pleasure to be able to say how proud I am as Internet NZ to continue our working relationship with these fine two on this fine work. And it's my pleasure as well to welcome all of you here today at this launch of the World Internet Project for this year. Now, just tiny little bits of housekeeping before I hand over to our speakers. The safety of your environment is your own, my friends. So please take note of wherever your exits are, because that is all on you this time. But more importantly, we will be running questions in the latter part of this particular seminar. I invite you that if you'd like to address the audience, please use the hand up function that you'll see on the bottom of your toolbar in your Zoom settings. And if you would not like to speak up, then please do put your question in the Q&A and I'll read it out for you instead. If many of you are very keen on asking questions, I'll have to exercise a little bit of editorial discretion in terms of choosing who comes up next. So please don't be offended if I don't pick you or I don't do things. I'll do as best as I can while respecting the timeframes that we have here too. And on that note, I think that that is certainly enough from me, and I can hand over to these fine two to talk about what the World Internet Project has to show us this year. Gail, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And kia ora. Welcome everyone to today's presentation, where we're launching a few findings on the World Internet Project 2021. And we'll shortly share some slides with you. I think Alex is going to share that, and assuming we have no technical glitches along the way. Cool. And while we're sharing some of the key findings on the World Internet Project 2021, we'll take a particular focus on the impact of last year's lockdown, the March-April lockdown in 2020. Let me start first with saying a thank you, though, to our funding partner, Internet New Zealand, who provided feedback during the survey design, the implementation, and they also gave feedback on the main report. I should also say thank you for feedback on the main report to DECA, the Digital Equity Coalition Aotearoa. That was much appreciated. And while I'm in the momentum of giving thanks, I should say a shout out to the support of the World Internet Project partners internationally, and in particular the founding director, Jeff Cole, who will call on at the end of this presentation to say a few words about the World Internet Project as well. I should start off also by saying, as Andrew pointed out, my name is Gail Pacheco. I am a professor of economics here and director of the New Zealand Work Research Institute at AUT, and I'll focus on some contextual findings before passing on to the lead author, Alex. And while you may have missed it in the first slide, I need to acknowledge the other two co-authors on this research, Mary Hedges and Antonio Diaz-Andrade. So what will I be talking about today, or what will we both be talking about, me and Alex, today? I'll give a little background on the World Internet Project for any of those in the audience who don't know much about what it covers. I'll then talk a little bit about the sampling methodology and our process for collecting the data. And then we'll divide up our key findings into 3 areas, noting that there's lots more in the report, and we'll give you a link to the report at the end, but we'll just focus on these particular 3 areas for the purpose of this presentation. So the 3 areas are the divide between users and non-users, and that is something I'll take you through, and then I'll pass to Alex, who will look at internet use during as well as after the COVID-19 lockdown, and then some interesting facts on internet users' opinions regarding privacy and social media, which we see has been really topical lately. Next slide, thanks. Okay, about the project. Well, this is the 7th iteration of the World Internet Project to run in New Zealand. It began in 2007, and the last iteration was 2017. The way the World Internet Project works is it's built upon a common set of international questions, and this allows benchmarking across a number of countries, up to 38 partner countries. And then we add further detail to some of those questions. So for instance, we add additional questions on disability. And in this iteration, we added a number of questions to try and understand the impact of COVID-19 and the March-April lockdown of last year. In future work, we'll also look at some of these trends. Given this is the 7th iteration, we'll try and look at some of the trends over time. Next slide, thanks. Okay, so how did we sample our participants and what were the methods we used? Well, what's key here is we separated it into 2 stages. Okay. So in stage 1, that was wholly focused on screening for internet use. So in this stage, it was conducted via computer-assisted telephone interviews, or CATI, and respondents were selected through random digit dialing, and this was split across landlines and mobiles. And the rationale behind determining this via CATI was that if we used online surveys, of course, that would introduce significant bias in terms of determining the user or non-user rate. But of course, we can't do the whole survey of 2,000 respondents via CATI, otherwise that would be prohibitively expensive. So we use this first method, and we did it with around 500, a sample of 500 to determine the non-user rate. Next slide, thanks. Okay. And then in the second stage, we then draw on an online panel for users. So that online panel was database providers through Qualtrics. Of course, we also collect our data from non-users that we'd collected in the first stage, where if they were identified as a non-user in stage 1, where possible, they proceeded straight to complete a full survey, or the interviewer arranged a time to call back. Plus, we did some additional CATI work to make sure it was representative of that non-user rate that we captured in stage 1. And a particular focus this time that maybe we didn't get as right in the last survey we ran in 2017 was we targeted quotas for ethnicity, age, and region. We wanted to be sure we were being representative in these spaces. And it was in that order. So ethnicity was our first priority, age and region, second and third priority. And we set up quotas based on the proportions of these groups according to the New Zealand Census 2018. So our final sample was made up of just over 2,000 individuals. I should also say that stage 1 was collected at the end of 2020 and stage 2 in early 2021. So at times when we were not in lockdown, like we were at the start of 2020, and like we are in Auckland at the moment now. Okay, some key stats. What did we find for users versus non-users? Well, 94% of our sample were users, with the remaining 6% being, of course, non-users. And here, non-users are defined as never using the internet, or have previously used it, but haven't used it in the last 3 months. And we took this data and split it a number of ways to see what do the patterns look like across some of the demographics. So first up, we've got age. And you can see here that if we look at any of the 10-year age bands between 16 to 64, the non-user rate hovers between 2% to 5%. But if you look at over 65s, the non-user rate jumps substantially to 16%. We also did this split for ethnicity. And here, the non-user rate ranges between 3% and 9%. The next one we did was by household income. And in this case, we can see much higher proportion of non-users for the lowest income category. So for those households that had under $30,000 as their household income, 13% of respondents who came from those households were non-users. I mean, this is a sizable group as well. It's worth pointing out because under $30,000 for household income is about 19% of the sample, which roughly matches, according to the census, the proportion of the population that fit into that income category as well. So it's a sizable group to worry about in terms of their internet use and access. In the next one, we start looking at why aren't the non-users using the internet? And there's a number of things that come up. So first of all, I should point out that 22% said there's no purpose to the internet. And I should note that a large proportion of these were over 65. And of the remaining responses given, about 30% of those responses point to the internet not being used because of not enough knowledge or no device or too expensive. So that's kind of pointing or signaling us towards knowledge and cost, or education and cost as being the barriers in this space. And similar numbers are here when we ask the question, what would help you become an internet user? Here, 35% said nothing would help, but mirroring the previous slide, or the results from the previous slide, we can see almost a third of non-users said cost or knowledge was a barrier, and this jumps closer to 50% if I include that second bar of understanding more about the benefits. Then we're getting to close to half of the non-users saying more knowledge or better access through lower cost would help. Some ways the users connect. So while not shown here, 35% of users connect to the internet mostly through their home connection. And the most common type of connection was fiber or broadband. And in this graphic, you can see what are the ways they connected when using multiple devices a day. And the most common way was computer and phone, using both those devices at least once a day. And next slide, thank you. And this is my last slide before I pass to Alex. But to kind of show you some of the particular groups we look at in the research, we add extra questions on disability, and we focused on assessing disability using the Washington Group short set of questions. And here our definition is, we were identified as having a disability if you said you had a lot of difficulty or were fully impaired. And you can see in the table there that the most common type of impairment was a physical impairment. And in our sample, we had 232 respondents who were defined as being impaired and 339 instances of disability. What's not shown in this slide is that of these disabled respondents, just 8% indicated their use or experience of the internet could be enhanced if they got additional help or equipment. And interestingly, another 22% said they didn't know how it could be enhanced. So this might signal that some individuals are not aware of what help or assistance exists in this space. Notably, close to half of the disabled respondents indicated that using the internet improved their quality of life and their social interactions. So I think that's really heartening to see. And it's at this point that I believe I pass to Alex, who will talk about some of the key aspects of the research that you've come to see in terms of what happened to internet use and access during COVID-19 and the lockdown we had last year. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Gail. And before I jump in, I just want to thank everyone for coming to this presentation. Because I appreciate your time so much, I'm going to jump straight into our COVID findings. So as Gail has foreshadowed, this year we included additional questions to investigate the impact of the COVID-19 lockdown on internet use. And of course, these results are therefore specific to that first March-April 2020 lockdown. In this portion of the survey, we asked respondents to compare their internet use during and before the lockdown to their current use at the time we took the survey, so when they weren't in any sort of lockdown. And we asked this question in relation to all 5 of the themes that we cover in the report, which are communication, information, entertainment, transactions, and learning. And this part of the survey also captures the immediate effect of the lockdown and some changes in internet use post-lockdown. So before we look at those themes specifically, I just wanted to highlight how many users reported receiving some form of help during that time period. And a note here that we are focusing on users for this section of the report. So 17% of users did receive some form of internet support during the March-April lockdown. And this does not indicate, however, how many users would have liked or would have needed internet support during that time. Now we've broken these respondents down by household income, and that is the figure shown on the slide. And we see here that 25% of individuals who received help were in this highest income bracket of $100,001 or more household income. And we also note, not shown in this slide, the top source of help came from family members and or friends, 54% of help from that source. Moving on to our first theme. So here we have internet use for the purpose of communication during and before the lockdown relative to at the time of the survey. So in interpreting these graphics, we note that all of these results are relative to when the survey was conducted. So the first part of the graphic illustrates the respondents' use before the lockdown relative to the use now at the time of the survey. And we find that 51% of respondents say that the use of the internet was the same at the time of the survey as it had been prior to the lockdown. Now, in the second part of the graphic, we see respondents' use during the lockdown in March, April of 2020, also relative to their use at the time of the survey. And here we note that 54% of respondents used the internet more during the lockdown compared to their use now. So this tells us something we kind of expected, that there was definitely a spike in internet use during the lockdown, but we also see that much of that spike, at least for communication purposes, was temporary. We also gathered some other information about the use of the internet for communication purposes over the lockdown, notably what activities respondents may have done for the first time ever in response to the lockdown. And we found that 1 in 5 respondents said that they made or received a voice or video call over the internet for the first time, which was very interesting. So lots more people Zooming as a result of lockdown. Information was our next theme. So here we see a similar pattern. Internet use for information spikes during the lockdown, with 45% of respondents saying they used the internet more during the lockdown compared to after at the time of the survey. And notably again, 55% of respondents then say that their use before the lockdown was the same as their use at the time of the survey. So much of that spike is temporary. We know from other information we collected that the top 2 types of new activities done for information purposes were looking up news and looking up health information on the internet. I suppose that isn't particularly surprising, but it is interesting to note. We then have entertainment purposes. So by now you can see this pattern is quite similar and it prevails in this domain as well. Internet use spiked for entertainment purposes during the lockdown, but then that spike did not continue post-lockdown. Here, playing video games online was the main new activity reported by respondents, alongside downloading and listening to music or watching videos for the first time on the internet. Our second to last theme was transactions. And of course, as expected, the top new thing to do online as a result of that first March-April 2020 lockdown was to buy things. I can relate to that. And a close second was to pay bills online. And we note that this actually coincides with a time when New Zealand banks announced the end of transactions through physical checks. And of course, you will remember that during this time, a lot of places stopped accepting cash. So some of that may have been influenced by those other things in the news. The final theme we covered in the report was using the internet for learning purposes. So this was one of the potentially surprising findings, in that the use of internet for learning didn't increase as much during the lockdown relative to other purposes that we've already been through, such as information or communication. And the main new activity done online for learning was to check facts or find a new fact online. So just it would be nice to summarize all of the new things respondents did for the first time as a result of the lockdown. So here they are by theme and descending order. So making or receiving that voice or video call, which I've already mentioned, 19% of respondents said they did that for the first time. 17% reported looking for news for the first time. 16% finding or checking a fact. 14% buying things online. And 13% playing games online. And it's notable that all of these are relatively sizable proportions. So lots of new internet activity due to that first lockdown. Now, we just want to highlight a few other interesting, noteworthy results from the World Internet Project survey. So I'm just going to cover 3 more findings that are not COVID specific. Note that we're just mentioning a handful, but there is a lot of more detail and more domains covered in the main report. So here we have some findings regarding internet privacy in New Zealand. So with respect to privacy, listed here are some of the negative experiences people had online. We can see that the largest proportion of respondents had a negative experience of being contacted by someone online asking them to provide bank or personal details. So that was 40% of respondents. Note that even for the activities that are less prevalent, they're still sizable. So for instance, 16% reported being bullied or harassed online. And we know that a third of those were between the ages of 16 and 24 years old. And this discussion about internet privacy segues into this next slide. So we asked individuals about who they thought or who they were most concerned about, that they were most likely to breach their privacy online. And more respondents were concerned about corporations rather than government, whether New Zealand or other violating their privacy. So here the top 2 bubbles are individuals who strongly agreed or somewhat agreed with the statements at the top of this figure. And we're focusing on the third statement. Individuals were concerned that private corporations are violating their privacy online. And when we sum these two, strongly agrees and somewhat agrees with these statements, we get over 50% of respondents agreeing. The proportions of respondents agreeing with the remaining statements are much smaller. And now we would be remiss not to highlight our results about social media, given there is so much debate about it at the moment, in particular with regards to Facebook. Or is it called Meta? Do we call it Meta? In any case, almost 60% of respondents stated that social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok ought to be more strongly regulated than they are now. And this figure illustrates this. So here we see that 27% of respondents strongly agreed that internet companies should be more strongly regulated, and 32% somewhat agreed. So again, this sums to almost 60% of responses. And not illustrated here, but noted on the slide, we also found 30% of respondents believe that these companies have made the world a worse place, which is a very substantial proportion. So those are all the additional findings I was hoping to highlight. I want to thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And I do want to note that the full report is available online now on the New Zealand Work Research Institute website, and that we'll also be sending out a copy of these slides to everyone that registered for the event. So in case you can't find the report online, you can always click the link on the final slide here, and it'll take you to that web page. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
And at that point, I'm going to invite the founding director of World Internet Project. Professor Jeffrey Cole, he's not just the founding director, but he's a director for the Center for the Digital Future at the University of Southern California, Annenberg, and he directs the World Internet Project internationally. So I'd like him to pass the floor to him to say a few words.
Thank you, Gail. And to Gail, to Alex, to Antonio, to Mary, what great work. This is still exciting to me. The internet is as interesting now as it has ever been. I'm delighted to be here at the end of your presentation. And once again, what great work. And Andrew, thank you for all of the support of Internet New Zealand. About 22 years ago, we had a pretty good instinct that the internet was going to change the world. I don't think you had to be a genius to see that coming. What the World Internet Project did was it wanted to take advantage of we knew the world was going to change and be able to document it. And now we have about 32 countries. New Zealand has been with us since 2006, almost the beginning. And we really do have a pretty comprehensive view of how the world has changed. Because when we started, everybody connected through a computer on the desk and a hard wire to the wall. Now that's become one of the least important ways people are gaining access to the internet. And it did change the world. But COVID, the biggest disruption in our lifetime, also turns out to be the victory lap of the internet. Think back to lockdown, and I know in Auckland you still have some lockdown. Think down to lockdown, we had 3 days to move our learning lives, our work lives, our buying lives, our entertainment online. Within a couple of days, what couldn't be done online couldn't be done. It reminded me, and I wrote a little piece about this, it reminded me from one of my favorite, and I think almost everybody's favorite film, It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, and where he finds out what life would have been like if he had never been born. I was trying to figure out, and a lot of us in the World Internet Project, what would the pandemic have been like if the internet had never been born? We wouldn't have been able to do much work. Learning would have basically come to a standstill. Buying would have been far more difficult. We really did see profound changes. And the work that Alex and Gail has just presented shows how important that is. So in our work, we saw massive numbers of non-users, although there aren't many overall, became users. Non-buyers became buyers. This was a profound event, or I think of as the victory lap. And the good news, sometimes people ask us, you've been doing this for 20 years, do you have to keep doing it? Is it still important? Haven't you found out what you want to find out? And what Gail and Alex just presented shows absolutely not. Look at this fascinating year and a half. Moving forward, we can see so many things. Alex talked with about as much enthusiasm as I have for Facebook renaming itself Meta, to really betting the whole company on the metaverse. Let's hope they don't end up dominating it, but the metaverse may end up being a critical alternate reality that transforms our use in the future. And all of the changes we're going to see through artificial intelligence, the permanent gains from COVID. So it is more exciting than it's ever been. I'm delighted to have been invited to say a few words. I've probably said more than a few, but to say a few words at the presentation. Great work. I only wish I could be there in person. I will as soon as it's possible. And congratulations. Really impressive work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for speaking. We will now take some questions, and I'll hand over to Andrew, who will hopefully direct us.
I'll be very happy to direct it as best as I can. Thank you, Alex. Now, people, to make my life as easy as possible in this regard, I'd really encourage you to use the Q&A function here too. I can see that there are some in there already. And please, I remind you all that I will do my damnedest to get through these questions, but if I have to exercise some discretion, I'll need to in order to respect all of our time here today. And because I am the person hosting us all here today, I'm going to take the first one, unless that's cheeky of me. I really enjoyed your point about the victory lap for the internet in terms of proving a whole pile of data and theory about the internet, Jeffrey. Thank you. Gail and Alex, was there anything in particular that stood out to you, either for being particularly notable about change due to lockdown in terms of how much it increased, or likewise, was there anything that caught you by surprise as an almost underwhelming response in terms of how the data moved in response to that change in environment?
I'm happy to take that one. I think both of us were like, okay, who's going to answer the question? I think the one thing that's interesting to me, and I think we need more data on this over time as well to understand how it changes. I'm very interested in changes post-lockdown, and also now this was captured, after the first main lockdown, and I'm interested in now after 5 lockdowns that we've had in Auckland, for instance, how are things evolving there in terms of if we capture this over time? Because I was interested to see that there was a spike and that I wasn't sure what would happen long term, and that the spike was mostly temporary. So it looks like there's a lot of people who prefer that face-to-face social interaction and return to some of their patterns pre-lockdown. But I'm interested to see if that persists in the future now that we've had multiple lockdowns as well.
Would you like to add anything, Alex?
No, I think that was brilliantly said. Thank you, Gail. I'm glad you jumped in.
I had some questions from the floor here then. In terms of the design of the disability question that you shared beforehand, and the nature about how it investigated physical issues such as arthritis. People with walking issues may also have other minor impairments, for example, that may limit device use. Does that data include that sort of insight there?
Yes, it does. So in a way, we use the Washington consensus, pardon me, questions to determine difficulty, and difficulty does include walking, climbing steps, and other difficulty with self-care, such as washing or dressing. And we do have data on individuals who maybe had lower levels of impairment. So they said they have a little bit of impairment from, or a little bit of difficulty with some of these items. However, we don't have a question particularly about arthritis specific to arthritis, for example. Hope that answers the question. So yes, there are broader levels of difficulty included in the data. We've just highlighted those individuals who said they had the highest level of difficulty in the report.
Wonderful, thank you. Now, Paula asks, what was the percentage again, please, of those who felt that the internet improved their quality of life?
It was close to 50%. So 50% of the say, and this is based on those who said, you know, a significant impairment, said that internet improved their quality of life and or their social interactions.
Thank you. And another clarifier here too, what does internet support mean? I can't quite remember the context where that term came up, I'm afraid.
So that was in regards to the COVID-19 lockdown, and we didn't specify, so we did let respondents choose what they felt support meant for them. So internet support is actually a very subjective in terms of this report. It could mean anything from someone teaching them how to use Zoom to someone helping them install a program, or even getting access to certain programs through their work.
And just to add to what Alex was saying, in the report, we also give a little bit of a breakdown on some of those things. So, you know, we can see some of the categories they ticked for internet-related support were device, or a software to help you work from home, or physically setting up the internet connection at home. So we have a breakdown of those different forms of support and how much of the respondents said yes to each of those. So I think it was close to 24% device was the main type of support.
Okay, thank you. Now, Nigel asks and notes actually that the increase of internet use during lockdown was less for learning compared with other activities that were looked at. And he wonders whether or not there is any cross-tabulation about how that squares with the number of respondents that were in formal education at the time.
So we haven't actually dug into the data by this sort of activities individuals were doing in terms of their formal learning, but we do have data on whether an individual was employed full-time or studying. So that could be done in the future. Just note that as the sample sizes get smaller and smaller, we can say less and less about these smaller groups of our sample. So that could be something we could look at. We could cut the data that way as well.
Cool. Thank
Gail,
you.
did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add that, so we present a lot of findings in the reports, you know, 40 pages long, but we can actually cut the data a lot more or a lot more different ways. So if anyone is keen on us kind of and says, oh, would you be able to look at it this way, and it's a simple enough split, I'm sure Alex will be able to kind of cut the data that way and send you a quick stat or two from the data.
Wonderful. And Nigel appreciates that answer too. Thank you for your thanks, Nigel. Now, Hamish asks about the regulation point, and this was one that stood out to me as well. about whether or not the question was designed to question about social media networks in particular, or the internet in general, with regard to that near 60% of respondents who talked about that positively.
So I'm just going to triple check before I answer that question, but from memory, that question was specifically about social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, and TikTok. And I'm pretty sure the survey actually gave those examples before asking the question. And our
Useful to know.
report does detail that a little bit further as well.
Oh, yes, and thank you. For those of you that may have missed it, if you do look in the chat, we've already shared the link to the full report data there as well. Not that I'm trying to distract you all from our fine speakers here, but if you've been waiting to find the full report itself, it's already in your hot little hands. Patty asks, is there any data about the internet consumption before and after lockdown, specifically for users with disability? They work in this area of accessibility and would be interested to understand more specificity about how that user group was impacted.
Yes, so as Gail mentioned before, this is another thing that maybe didn't make it all the way into the report, but it is something I could do with the data. If Patty wants to contact me, I would happy to see if I can cut the data some way about that will tell her more about those respondents with disabilities and the impact of lockdown on them specifically.
Right. Now, Heather here has a suggestion rather than a question about separating the age group, particularly in the senior category, between those that are 75 plus versus those 65 to 75, and whether it would be possible to be more granular in that plus 65 age group to distinguish between the senior and the more senior.
Yes, so in the data we have birth year, and so I could definitely look at those over 75, although I can't guarantee we have a huge number of respondents in that category. So I could look at that for Heather and see if we have a substantial enough group of respondents there to be able to cut the data more ways. Because we could have a really tiny proportion of those over 65 that are also over 75, or it could be the majority of that group. And at the moment, I'm not sure.
Cool, thank you. Now, Philippa asks, were there any health questions asked, particularly relating to mental health during lockdown, and how the internet either positively or negatively impacted people's mental well-being?
We didn't cover mental health specifically in this version of the report. So unfortunately, that wasn't something we delved into that deeply in this survey.
Next up is from Nia, who apologizes because this may have been covered while they were making a cup of tea. Is there a big disparity or gap between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities that you can see in any of this data?
Well, our findings, oh, Gail, did you want to?
No, you go
take
ahead.
this question? All right. Our findings in terms of users and non-users by ethnicity, this is something we were really concerned about. In a way, we really wanted to see whether there were some disparities there, but we only saw the percentage of non-users vary by about 3 percentage points between different ethnicity groups in New Zealand. So there doesn't seem to be huge disparities there in terms of the different ethnic communities that we sampled.
Got you. And likewise, Maureen asks whether or not there was any regional difference that you could see coming through the data.
So we did look at urban and rural users and non-users. So we did capture some of those differences, although we didn't actually find a huge difference between the rate of users and non-users that were rural or urban. Although it is important to note that we didn't capture the quality of internet connection or whether the individual's more likely to maybe connect to the community a spot rather than at home. So there may be still be some disparities there that our report did not capture. But in terms of just plain rural and urban, there wasn't a huge difference at all.
That's interesting. Thank you. And thank you for the question too, Maureen. I've got a couple here from Caroline. Thank you, Caroline. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about the learning aspects that you do have in this data, about what this data shows about the learning experience online and how that may have differed either during the COVID experience or in absolute terms as shown in the data?
Sure. So one of the questions we asked, we dived in more specifically into what actual activities individuals did for learning purposes during the lockdown. And we wanted to see how many new activities. So I've highlighted that top one, that in terms of learning, people found or checked a fact online for the first time because of the COVID-19 lockdown. But we also found that 15% started looking up definitions of words for the first time using the internet, getting information for schoolwork or study-related work, that was 11%, and participating in formal online learning for an academic degree or job was 10%. So I think what a lot of respondents experienced was that gap at the beginning of the lockdown where there was no online platform set up for them straight away to jump into. And from memory, universities were actually in a break at the beginning of that March-April 2020 lockdown. And I'm sure most of you will know that a lot of universities already have online learning platforms. So we do think that formal learning probably wasn't the main focus of our respondents during the lockdown, or a lot of individuals who were already in formal learning were already doing a lot of these things online. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I might just add a little bit at the end there. Thanks, that's really useful, Alex. So yeah, when you look at the report, so one area we didn't cover, Caroline, was in the report, we have a section on the impact of COVID and what changed for various domains like learning and what was new activities they did in learning. But there's also a whole section of the report on all of these domains, and within each of those domains, what activities people are doing generally. So within learning, for instance, we look at looking up definitions, getting information, participating in formal learning, and we ask their frequency as well in terms of how often they're doing that regularly. Like, do they do that monthly, weekly, daily, several times a day? So we get their kind of regular activities in these spaces in one section of the report, and then in the other section we focus on impact of COVID. So you can get more breakdown on learning across both of those domains if you have a look at the report as well.
And I have one last question for you, Fine, too, from our audience, again from Caroline. Is there a question that asks whether individuals feel their internet use has improved their economic situation from the internet use?
No, that's a simple answer. I wish there was. There were only so many questions we could put our respondents through, but that would be a really fantastic question to ask them in the future, because health and physical health are really important, but economic health is equally interesting to think about. So yeah, thank you very much for that question.
Well, on behalf of our audience here, I would like to thank the two of you for answering those questions in that presentation. Thank you. That was most excellent. And Jeffrey, I think you're still there too. Thank you very much for joining us today as well and adding your perspective from the World Internet Project in general. It's very rare that this pans out so nicely, audience. Thank you. There was almost the perfect number of questions to perfectly fill the question portion of this event. Oh, I couldn't have asked for better. But this is also now a perfect time for me to go into the close and respect all of your people's time by making sure that we have this nicely wrapped up by midday. I do want to say thank you to our two fine speakers from the Work Research Institute at AUT as the home of the World Internet Project here in New Zealand. I think you've seen today exactly the value that excites us here at Internet NZ in terms of this. Not only a comprehensive report that's already available to you in the chat, and a presentation that will be sent out to you after this. Thank you for registering, which will include a link to the report too, might I add. But also you can see too the value of the long tail of data that has been collected over time in terms of continuing to fulfill a consistent methodology and being able to build that specifically New Zealand lens on this data. Also too, the unique value of the World Internet Project and having comparativity across many of these questions with other jurisdictions to be able to see what's different between New Zealand and other parts of the world as well. This is why this is such a unique and valuable piece of research. So thank you very much for coming and hearing these fine two talk about this time's iteration. Now, I think I've covered off everything that I need to cover off. The last thing that I would like to do then is invite our two speakers if they'd like to say anything in closing.
Good. I just want to thank Alex, who did the bulk of the work, and not just doing the bulk of the work, answered the bulk of the questions. Well done, Alex. And who also did some media on this morning on the radio. So huge thank you to Alex for all the work here. Well done.
No, thank you very much. And thank you, Andrew, for chairing this and really guiding us through all those questions as well. And we really appreciate everyone who attended today. It was an honor to present to you all. So I'm looking forward to all of your emails with more questions.
Well,
Thank
yes,
you.
exactly. And as Alex has already highlighted here, one of the valuable things about the World Internet Project too is if you have a case that can be pulled out of this data, that there is some ability to do exactly that, slicing and dicing and find out those little pieces as well. And Alex and Gail are the right people to contact about that too. I should stop talking. Since we started with a karakia, it's only appropriate that I close us with a karakia as well. So, unuhia te pō whiri marama. Tomokia te ao whatu tangata. Tātai ki runga, tātai ki raro, tātai aho rao. Humie huie tai kie. Thank you all very much for joining us today. That is the end of today's seminar on the World Internet Project. I hope you all have a wonderful Friday and weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.